Hello, and welcome to the dialogue on perspectives on society after COVID-19 that jointly organized by the Australian National University and the University of Tokyo. I'm Yusuke YOKOYAMA, Professor of Geosciences and Environmental Science at the University of Tokyo at Atmosphere and Ocean Research Institute. And I'm going to moderate today's session. ANU and the U Tokyo have a history of collaboration in various fields. You could find a part of the history visiting our websites, as well as watching the first series of this series of the video. But briefly, ANU and U Tokyo established the strategic partnership agreement in March 2015 to promote further collaboration in research and teaching, in particular for the field of interdisciplinary studies. We plan the dialogues of this time on the basis of the tight and friendly partnership between the universities. Faculties of the two universities will exchange their thoughts and information and discuss various perspectives of post-COVID-19 pandemic, and today, in particular, climate and environmental science and society. I have two eminent scientists who are studying climate and environmental sciences, as well as engineering with me, Professor Nerilie ABRAM of the Australian National University, and Professor OGUMA Kumiko of the University of Tokyo. So first, let me introduce them very briefly. Professor Nerilie ABRAM is a climate scientist at the Australian National University. She leads a drought research program in the Center of Excellence for Climate Extreme and is Deputy Director of the Australian Center for Excellence in Antarctic Science. Her research focuses on reconstructing climate variability over the last 1,000 years from corals and Antarctic ice cores to give a long-term perspective on the processes and significance of recent anthropogenic climate change. She recently serves as coordinating lead author for the IPCC special report on the ocean and biosphere in a changing climate that was released in September 2019. And she is a member of the International Climate Crisis Advisory Board Group chaired by Sir David King. And Professor OGUMA Kumiko is specialized in the environmental engineering at the University of Tokyo. Her research target is water with particular focus on water treatment technologies, waterborne diseases, sustainable water supplies, and safe water access in developing countries and remote communities. In the context of Sustainable Development Goal 6, on the water, she is currently leading several field testing projects in multiple locations, including an off-grid island and remote villages, to understand the strength and weakness of decentralized water systems. She is the Vice President of International Ultraviolet Association and recognized as one of the leaders to apply UV-based technologies for water safety. So both work in the field of the currently changing Earth environment. Today, Professor ABRAM and OGUMA will focus on climate change, climate variability that will affect our society in significant manner, in particular through changing the weather pattern that could create the changes in hydrological cycles. This will affect our society, in particular for the agriculture and perspectives of the safe water availability. I look forward to listening to their view on these topics. So without further ado, dear colleagues, good afternoon. today I'd like to ask Professor ABRAM to start talking about diagnostics of the current climate, and then Professor OGUMA to talk about the situation with regards to the water in the world. Then we can have a free discussions using those two short presentations as the starting point. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. And let's start Nerilie. Let's use the first name for the dialogue today. For your thoughts on climate change and climate variability, as well as environmental changes, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's lovely to join you both today. So where I wanted to start was to look at where we're at in the climate change story. And so in August of this year, we saw the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their assessment of the physical basis for climate change. What that report shows is that we've now warmed the climate by around about 1.1 degrees measured over the last decade compared to the pre-industrial. And that warming is entirely attributed to human activities. We're already seeing the impacts of that warming, particularly in the way that it affects extreme events right across the planet. And this year we've seen a number of those examples. We saw the terrible heat wave in the Pacific Northwest earlier this year, was then followed by wildfire as well. I know that Japan and China and parts of Europe have also experienced terrible flooding this year. These are the type of impacts that we expect to continue to get worse as climate change continues to develop. Now, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is that those extremes are caused by the overall warming of the climate, but they're also caused by the natural year-to-year variability of the climate system. And the way that humans are changing the climate is also changing the way that year-to-year variability happens as well. And that's largely the focus of my research. So I wanted to talk through a few examples of some of the recent discoveries that have been made in that area. And so if we go to Australia, where I'm based, there are 3 main drivers of the year-to-year variability that determine what type of extreme year we might have. And so in the Pacific Ocean, we have the El Nino Southern Oscillation. In the tropical Indian Ocean, we have the Indian Ocean Dipole. And then to the south of Australia, we have the Southern Annular Mode. And so all of those natural factors are acting on top of the long-term climate warming and affect our year-to-year climate and whether we have a hot year or a cool year or a wet year or a dry year. So if we go to the tropical Pacific, looking at El Nino Southern Oscillation, we can use corals from the tropical oceans to make very detailed reconstructions of the temperature variability that's been happening in those oceans over hundreds to thousands of years. And what we can see when we look at those reconstructions is that El Nino is changing so that the swings between El Nino years and La Nina years are becoming larger. So the potential impact of El Nino on the system is becoming larger because of climate change. We can also see that not every El Nino event is like every other El Nino event, and there are particular flavors of El Nino. And this was particularly research that was first initiated by researchers in Japan, looking at Central Pacific El Nino events compared to Eastern Pacific focused El Nino events. And again, if we look at our coral records, we can see that the Central Pacific type of El Nino events are becoming more common as we move into a warming future. When we have the Eastern Pacific events, they're becoming much stronger as well. So again, these signatures that we can see only through having these coral records that give us a very long background of information on how the climate system naturally works, and then being able to show us how that natural variation is being changed by climate change. We can do the same in the Indian Ocean, and my research has been looking particularly in the Eastern Indian Ocean and looking at how we can reconstruct positive Indian Ocean dipole events. These are events that cause particularly bad drought and lead to wildfires in southern Australia. And what we can see with those events is that those positive Indian Ocean dipole events are becoming more common and they're becoming stronger. And if we put that paleoclimate information together with observations and with climate models that look into sort of what the future looks like under different emission scenarios, what we can see is that we expect that trajectory to continue, where those positive events will be happening more often and becoming stronger. So we can expect them to be playing a much larger role in our climate variability. Then if we want to look at the southern annular mode, we can use a whole range of paleoclimate information for that, including ice cores from Antarctica. And what those records are able to tell us is that we are seeing a positive shift in the southern annular mode. And what that means is that the westerly winds that travel around the Southern Ocean to the south of Australia, those westerly winds are moving further south, moving closer to Antarctica. And what the effect that has on Australia is that it draws the rainfall that we would normally receive in winter further south. So parts of southern Australia are becoming drier because of that. And again, that's a trend that we expect to continue into the future as climate change develops. A really sort of clear example of the impact of this was felt in Australia during the 2019-2020 Black Summer, the terrible fires that we had here. And those fires were a combination, not just of the climate becoming warmer and parts of southern Australia becoming overall drier because of climate change, but also because in that year we had a very large positive Indian Ocean dipole event. And we also had an unusual event happening over Antarctica, which again caused parts of Australia to become even drier and hotter than they would have otherwise been. And so together, that long-term climate change as well as the climate variability led to that terrible situation where we had these wildfires into the future, these terrible wildfires in Australia. So that was the main thing that I wanted to talk about in the introduction today, but just to highlight the importance of not only understanding the long-term patterns of climate change, the long-term trends, but also what happens in the year-to-year variability that drive these extreme events, which have a huge impact on people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Nerilie. Yeah, that's a really great, the summary of the current climate situation. So then, could I ask Kumiko to share your thoughts about water-related issues?
Okay, let me share my slide. Can you see my slide now?
Yep.
Okay, good. So it's my great honor to make some talk or short presentation here today to share some issues all related to water. So this is OGUMA, and I belong to the Department of Urban Engineering, and my specialty is environmental engineering. So here comes some short stories of the water issues with potential impact on the world and post-pandemic. So let me first summarize the water issues that now we are facing, which include, of course, the number one item is the urbanization and the population growth, which is occurring still in developing countries, and which make less access to safe water supply and sanitation because of the delay of the infrastructure constructions compared to the very rapid increase of the population in urban areas. And item number two is on the contrary to such situation in developing countries, the aging of infrastructures and the depopulation or the population decline is really happening in developed countries, of course, including in Japan. And this makes practical and financial difficulties to maintain the current water systems. And item number three is the excess withdrawal of groundwater in many countries, especially in developing countries. And then this caused the land subsidence and also some health concerns due to the contamination of the soil-derived contaminants like arsenic and fluoride, which is included in the groundwater and cause some health concerns to humans. That is the number 3 item that I'd like to mention here. And number 4 is, of course, the climate change. And as I already explained very in a professional way by Nerilie, the climate change is causing a lot of difficulties in the water resources. So, of course, for example, the frequent and more intense floods and droughts are happening year-round, and looks like getting worse year by year. And also another item is actually we are observing some enhanced algal bloom in water resources like reservoirs and lakes. That is assumed that due to the higher temperature of water and also the ambient air is a happier conditions for some toxic algae, and they are blooming even in northern countries. So this is causing the deterioration of water qualities and water resources. And item number 5 is new and diverse pollutants are now there in water environment. The things include something like pharmaceuticals or personal care products or some newly developed chemicals and some microplastics and so on. And those new and diverse kinds of pollutants are now observed in water environment, and many of them are just unknown with the impacts to human health and ecosystems. So this is another big issue now we are facing in line with water. So if we talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, here comes some water issues that suddenly emerged or highlighted in this pandemic situation. There must be many items that is highlighted under COVID, but I'd like to mention only 2 items here today. The number 1 is the wastewater-based epidemiology, or it's called WBE. And this is a kind of field of study to monitor microbes in wastewater and use that data to estimate the number of patients in the region and try to make some precautionary actions to mitigate the situation. So under this COVID-19, of course, the target is SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we already can see the very active movement in the international consortium to monitor SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater to estimate the number of patients in the service region of the wastewater system and try to catch the increase of the number of patients even before some surveys by the patients and try to make some precautionary actions. That is really emerged in this situation. And number 2 item is the concern on the water for hand washing actually. And it is, of course, apparent that hand washing is vital to mitigate any infectious diseases, including COVID. But still, so many as 40% of the world's population, which accounts for 3 billion of people in the world, do not really have a hand washing facility with water and soap at home. So this is really a big issue. Probably this concern was there for years, but it's very much highlighted under COVID. So this is one paper that I'd like to mention. This shows the inequalities in access to water and soap in sub-Saharan African countries. So on the left-hand side figure, we can see the gap among those countries, and also even the bigger gap for the urban and rural residents. The urban people better have the access to hand washing water, but it's much less in rural areas in all countries. And also, if we see the gap in the wealth, based on the wealth, poor to rich, we also see even the bigger gap, even in the same country, a huge gap based on the wealth. in the access to the hand washing water. So actually, the inequality in access to safe drinking water has long been a big issue, and it's long been discussed in many aspects for years and years. And now that concerns are expanded to hand washing water, how to take these gaps and minimize this gap is now the big concern under COVID. And well, in line with the urban versus rural context, I found one interesting data as shown here. So in general, we know the water systems require users' participation to operate and maintenance in some ways. And if we see the countries with policies or procedures for user and community participation in water supply systems, in urban areas, it's around 80%, and in rural areas, slightly higher than urban, but it's also like 85%. So the community's participation is anyhow expected in water supply systems. And if we focus more to see the countries with policies or procedures with specific mention of women's participation in water supply, I found this is interesting to see that in urban areas, the countries mentioning the participation of women to urban water supply is 33%, while the ratio is much higher in rural community water supply. More than half of the countries surveyed answered they have the specific mention of women's participation in water supply in rural water supply systems. These two bullet points may be a kind of over-interpretation of this data, but I'd like to mention this here. So the small-scale decentralized systems like rural-based, community-based water supply systems expects more participation by the community in general, even so far. And under COVID-19 and the world after this pandemic, we may see some transition from centralized to decentralized systems. This means the small-scale water supply or wastewater treatment systems based on the community. And if we see this kind of transition, then such movement may require more participation by the community and potentially maybe empower the women to run the system at their own responsibilities. That's what I just over-interpret this kind of statistics. So this is the final slide that I'd like to mention now. The post-pandemic world may go into those concepts. Well, I just try to pick up some keywords that are now running around us. So I do not really explain the details, or I cannot really explain what this really means. However, I'd like to mention the keywords that may come after pandemic. Number one is, of course, inclusive society. We hear this keyword a lot these days, and more people with diverse kinds of backgrounds are expected to play more important roles in such society. That's how I understand the inclusive society. And number two, the new normal lifestyle. This is another keyword that are running around us these days. And in such new normal life, I would say we are searching for the best mixture of virtual and real activities. And that's no one knows the best mixture of these two, I understand. And probably the best mixture or the best balancing point of virtual and real is maybe different in different countries or different situations. So searching for that would be a big issue, I think. And in such a new normal lifestyle, I would expect more respect and also the more responsibilities of individuals. Such society may come in new normal life. And number 3, as I mentioned, I would expect some transition of the social systems from centralized to decentralized systems. In other words, from large scale to a smaller scale. Then the change in the concept of infrastructure may be needed. And again, let me say this, we may see the more participation of individuals and the communities, and even more women's participation may be needed. And finally, another keyword that I see a lot is the green recovery. This is the concept to restructure the economy while mitigating the climate change. As we had a huge damage to the economy under COVID, then why don't we think of this green recovery to restructure the economy? That is a great idea, I think. And this paper mentions that the top 5 policies good for green recovery includes clean infrastructure, which is really related to my research topic, and building efficiency retrofits, and education training. Of course, we are at the university, we need to think about that too. And natural capital investment. This is also related to the environmental issues. And clean R&D or some rural support spending in low and middle income countries. So these policies may be more significant in the world after COVID. All right, sorry for the scattered presentation, but that's what I wanted to mention to kick off the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kumiko. That's really very nice summary for the current issues. So the Nerilie summarized the current situation of the climate, and of course, the climates, we often talk about the temperature change, but of course, the temperature change causes some other factors, including, the weather pattern change that could relate to the water availability. So it's kind of linked together, isn't it? So, so Nerilie, I think, could you also explain a bit more about the structure of IPCC? Because I think, today's topic is, look like, different two topics, but it's interrelated, I think, right? Because IPCC also has 3 working groups, and this year's report is working group number 1, isn't it? So could you explain a bit more for the structures? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that. The report that was released in August is the first of 3 reports that will be released by the 3 different working groups of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that first report is all about the evidence that we have for the physical basis of climate change. So it covers what causes climate change, how well do we know that, how well can we measure that, what do we see about those climate processes in the past, what are the projections when we move forward, and quite importantly, now that we have the framework of the Paris Agreement, what carbon budget do we have left if we are to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So that's the first assessment report. Sorry, that's the first working group report. And so early next year, we'll see another 2 reports released. The working group 2 report will be all about the impacts that climate change has for people and for ecosystems, and the type of adaptations that are going to be needed for those changes. We're already seeing that in some places adaptation is already needed, and that's something that will be needed because we will get to 1.5 degrees. Hopefully we won't go too much further than that, but we certainly need to be planning for a world with impacts related to 1.5 degrees of warming. And then the third working group report that will come out shortly afterwards is about what do we do about the problem of climate change, and particularly what mitigation options are available for helping to respond to this problem. And then they will also be followed by a synthesis report that draws together all of that information, and that will end the sixth cycle. So this is the sixth cycle of IPCC reports. The first cycle released its reports in 1990. So it's about 3 decades that we've been having these reports periodically released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So yeah, now we I think we get some summary of the current baseline of the climate. If you look back in the past and also projecting the future, and also you talked about some extreme climate events as well. So if you look at the climate patterns, and also you mentioned about the ENSO and El Nino Southern Oscillations and Indian Ocean dipoles and Southern Annual Mode, that is also significantly affect the regional climate pattern as well, right? And I think that could create flooding or droughts and so on, isn't it? In terms of like Western Pacific regions or wider Asian regions, could you also recap your talk? What sort of weather pattern we are predicting, like flooding and the droughts and so
on? Yeah, happy to do that. So when we look at warming, it's a fairly sort of consistent picture. Basically, as global warming gets worse, virtually everywhere on the planet gets hotter, but some areas, particularly the Arctic, warm faster than other areas, and the land areas will warm faster than the oceans. When we go and look at the rainfall impacts, we have very strong regional patterns. So there are some places that will become wetter, and there are some places that will become drier. Places that become drier are particularly sort of the mid-latitude areas, so South Africa, Southern Australia, parts of South America, parts of North America, particularly the western side of North America, and the Mediterranean. So those are all areas that we expect as the climate warms, those areas will get drier. Other areas, including areas along the tropics, are expected to get wetter. One of the really interesting things, though, is that even in those places that are getting drier, we can also expect that when they do have rain, that rain will be more extreme. So you can have a climate that overall is getting drier, and the challenges that has for overall your water security and making sure there is enough water for people and for agriculture and industry. But when the rain falls, it's falling in more intense packets of rain. And so you'll also have increased risk of flooding. So there are some places in the world where they're going to have to be planning for both not enough water, but when the water falls, there's going to be too much water. So it's a real challenge in terms of the adaptation. And then what we see in terms of how bad those impacts are is that it's very much related to how much we let the climate warm. So those patterns stay the same in terms of which areas are getting drier and which areas are getting wetter. But if warming gets to 2 degrees, the impacts are more intense than warming of 1.5 degrees. If it gets to 3 degrees, it's more intense again. So the more we let the climate warm, the bigger the challenge is going to be about how we deal with water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I think also Kumiko's talk, she mentioned about the 5 bullet points talking about the current issue we are facing in terms of the regards to the water. And number 4, I think, was related to the climate change. So do you have any experiences during your field work or under the collaborations that those your project kind of have to readjust because of the climate change and so on, or pollutions and so on?
Well, thank you for identifying that topic. I was just thinking and remembering some of my memories that I had in Southeast Asian countries, and in such countries they had quite common to have the rainwater harvesting systems, and people are just relying on that for the daily water use, even including drinking water. They drink rainwater in many cases, and many of them say the rainfall patterns are changing year by year, and they really feel it. And having the very traditional rainwater harvesting procedures not really working well as it used to be. So such kind of stories are all around, and people are really feeling that. And the daily life is totally relying on water access. So such pattern change is a big issue and a very challenging issue for those countries.
Yeah.
And for the flooding, I had one interesting experience in Indonesia, Jakarta. I visited the slum area to do some water quality survey after flooding. And of course, we see a lot of water around us. Still, people are looking for drinking water. That means in a flooding situation, plenty of water is there, but no water drink. Yeah, that happens. So we need to think of any intervention to promote some technologies or whatever to produce some drinkable, potable water out from the water resources in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No. I think that's really important and critical, particularly because under those circumstances, I think the sanitation issues are always a big, right? And of course, under the COVID situation, we are asked to, of course, everybody, like at the went to the kindergarten, and then we told that we should wash the hand. But of course, it's really happy to have clean water to wash the hands. Without thinking, having clean water is really prestigious, actually, under those circumstances, isn't it? So that's kind of motivation, Kumiko, that you try to develop the clean water system, is it?
Yes. I'm now running one project off the Great Island in the Philippines, and trying to treat the groundwater that is locally available with the solar power energy to turn on some system and supply the safe water.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that's, also you mentioned about decentralization systems.
Yes.
And do you have, could you also elaborate a bit more about the merit or advantage that we should have those decentralization system under this, changing climate condition we are facing?
Okay, well, originally I was thinking to propose some point of use water devices, which is called point of use, means that some small device attached to the tap and do some treatment at the point of use. For the developing countries where the infrastructures are delayed in the development, but people are just increasing the number, then why don't we use this kind of small devices for now? That was my first motivation to go for it. And then apart from that, as another project, I was thinking how to think of the rehabilitation of the aged infrastructures in developed countries, of course in Japan mostly. And I noted it's really, really financial difficulties are there to rehabilitate the aged infrastructure under the depopulating society. And then I just came up with the idea that why don't we use this small device originally proposed for developing countries to those rural communities in developing countries? Because why don't we give up or stop using the very large-scale centralized systems if it does not really fit the size of the population in those local communities? And why don't we use a small-scale decentralized water treatment in such cases? So, well, eventually I noted the technically or in engineering viewpoints, the technologies that are really needed in developing urbanizing areas and depopulating rural communities are actually quite similar, or I would say mostly the same. So that's how my project has some connection, and I'm trying to propose such systems to those two totally different areas, but the devices are quite similar.
Yeah, so I think also like you know, what do you call decentralization systems has advantage because you have a different well, kind of a, you know, mitigation against extreme event as well, isn't it? You have a centralization systems. If that system is broken, everybody get you know, bad water or something. So yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, so that's interesting and
yeah,
important.
It's more resilient, I would say.
Yeah, that's right. That's the word. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Nerilie, of course, you know, Australia is a huge countries, and the different part of the countries has different climate patterns, and also you are studying the drought research. You know, you are part of the drought research program, and which is really closely related to the water availability and also the quality of the water, right? So do you have any you know, anything that you know, you could share with us about your knowledge and you know, experience in Australia and so on?
Yeah, very happy to. So yes, drought is a very big problem in Australia. Looks to be a problem that is becoming worse. I think one of the really interesting things with the science of how we think about drought is we've seen that really change in the last few years. So I guess typically we kind of think of drought as being just a lack of rainfall. So when we just have these very dry conditions. And so often the research has been focused around sort of what causes those dry conditions. Whereas I think in Australia, we're now starting to realize that actually we're a dry country and drought is probably part of the natural climate that we have to live with. But what happens is that every now and again we get extreme rainfall that actually breaks a drought. And so what we're really sort of are focusing our attention now on is trying to understand what causes those years where we get the drought breaking rainfall, because that's the rainfall that's actually really critical for resetting the environment so that it brings us out of those persistently dry conditions. It does look like there's a very strong link to the tropical climate variability, so La Nina years and negative Indian Ocean dipole years. And in Australia at the moment, we're actually having a lot of rainfall related to both of those climate factors, and that has broken the drought that we had up until sort of early in 2020. So I think that's just a really sort of interesting way of thinking about drought. The other really sort of interesting and important way of thinking about drought is that it's not just the absence of rainfall, the absence of the drought breaking rains, but there's also a feedback there with temperature. And so our droughts are getting hotter. And so when we have those hot conditions, we're also able to draw more moisture out of the environment, and that dries things further. And that also feeds back to also make the temperature above those dry areas hotter as well. So there is a a feedback there that amplifies the problem, and that's potentially something that will get worse into the future as well, because we know the temperature will continue to go up. So there is that potential for our droughts to become worse, not just because of the change in rainfall, but also because of the rising temperature as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I think everywhere we are facing, experiencing or feeling those climate changes as well. And so of course, we've been talking about IPCC, and this year a sixth assessment report was issued. That's the working group number 1, but the following report is coming up next year. And also the COP26 is held in Glasgow in UK this year. And also the Nobel Prize in Physics this year was awarded for the climate sciences, right? That Suki Manabe is alumni. Of course, he's at Princeton University right now, but Dr. Manabe was alumni of the U Tokyo. So we are also happy that he received the prizes. But the point is that I think the public awareness is important to tackle this kind of a global issue, isn't it? And then also the water related issue. And I think Kumiko in her talk, she talked about a little bit about the rural versus urban, the women participations, differences, and so on. So of course, to address these kind of issues, increasing public awareness are key, because we need to ask the policymaker to change or mitigate the things as well. So is there any changes for the last several years in Australia that this kind of issues talked a lot more than used to be? Or
I think generally, yes, there's a lot more discussion about climate change. I think in terms of the public view, there's a lot more concern and awareness about climate change. I think Australia is an interesting example, because at the national level, we're not one of the leaders in terms of taking action on climate change, probably at the other end of the pack. For example, for the COP26, which is going on at the moment, there was an expectation that countries would be increasing the ambition of their 2030 pledges for emission reductions. Australia didn't do that. So Australia has still got its existing emissions target for 2030. It did take in a target of net zero by 2050. So that is new, and that's a step in the right direction. It's not enough in terms of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement and doing our fair share in that. But it's a step in that direction. So I think that's what people see at the national level, and sort of what Australia looks like internationally. But I think some of the more positive things in Australia are that each of the local governments have much stronger targets in terms of emission reductions, and much more aligned to the scientific evidence of what's needed. And so there is actually a lot of movement at that sort of more localized scale, in terms of starting to make those transitions and to make them at the speed that we need to make them. There's still a long way to go, but there are promising signs there that things are moving, but the frustration that scientifically it's a problem that we've let get to a point where every year actually matters now. And so there is a need for Australia as a whole to be doing more than what it's promised so far to do, but hopefully we are seeing a change in the ambition to do that, and particularly the public also being involved in that, and industry also involved in that, and saying that we need to do more.
Yeah, thank you. So so the move, it's not the movement, but it's like I mean the people talk a lot as well. I mean in the local level as well. So yeah, that's good. So the Kumiko, you introduced interesting topic about the women's participation story. Could you expand a bit more about those stuff, because educations and those stuff is important. Yeah.
Okay, well, honestly, I'm not the specialist on the gender issues at all, but I just wanted to mention that because I really found the data very interesting. And even if I go elsewhere to meet people face to face, I always noted the water issues are really, really managed by females. So the women have a even stronger power than males to when to take the water or how to take the water, how to share the water and those things. So I think in line with regard to the water issues, women's participation is really a key. And even for the education at home, the kids tend to learn some behaviors, like even the hand washing behaviors, I would say more from the mom, probably. So in such cases, I would say the females' participation or contribution to the very daily life water use to the community scale water supply systems, the females are very much expected to play key roles in many countries, or all over the world, maybe.
Yeah. Are there any similarities in Australia? I mean, for those, do you know any statistics about this as well? Or?
I'm afraid I don't know statistics, but I absolutely agree that we need to be taking into account a diversity of views in terms of where the solutions are, and I think typically in leadership positions, women have been underrepresented, as have other minorities, and so that's something that is changing, but is changing very slowly, and those different viewpoints are really important, particularly for coming up with the solutions to such a tricky problem as climate change.
Yeah, so I think the importance is that we should talk more, at home and the house and everywhere to discuss about current issues, including climate change and water availabilities and so on. And I guess, the drinking water and also like toilet is also another issue, isn't it, for the different part of the world. And I think that's also related to any communicable disease as well, and so on. So are there any projects you're currently conducting, Kumiko, with regards to those issues? Yeah.
Well, for now, what I'm running is mostly for drinking water only. But of course, water is a circulating resource, and the wastewater in the upstream of the river, for example, can be the source water of drinking water downstream. And in that sense, the water treatment and water management is very much linked with the wastewater or the toilet flushing issues. So of course, we always need to think about that as a total system, as a circulating resource.
Yeah, so I heard that Los Angeles, for example, they are, recycling the water, wastewater, because of the long-lasting droughts. So is there any activities in Australia about those recycling water projects?
So it's certainly something that water companies are thinking about. I mean, largely in Australia, water is managed by large corporations rather than on a sort of on a smaller level, but particularly in areas where water is becoming scarce. there does need to be sort of a reframing, particularly in terms of the public acceptance of ways that we can recycle water, because it is an important resource. One of the other things that we're seeing in Australia is a number of our major cities now have desalination plants, and you can obviously do that for coastal cities. And particularly Perth is an example where the city now has a very large proportion of its drinking water is provided through desalination, and that's a direct result of both the growth of population in that part of Australia, but also the long-term decline in the rainfall that part of Australia is receiving, and the effect that that's had on having to change where drinking water comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of right now the big movements, I think, because it's a limited amount of the resources, even water. So that's why we need to recycle. We need to be aware of sustainabilities and so on. So I think the climate change and also the sustainable development goals, SDGs, are really related, and those the inclusiveness and also the equalities and other issue that we talked about is in one of those 17 target as well, isn't it? So I guess like educations, for example, really are key. And is any activities with regards to educations are going on in your research center, Nerilie, for the climate and also the environmental issues?
Yeah, I think there's a whole range of ways that climate change sort of communication comes in. There's certainly a need to be making sure that the public is aware of this information. We are seeing that climate change, climate science is now part of the school curriculum. So young people are coming through with a good understanding of the climate change problem, which I think is really a necessary thing, because into the future, this is a problem that's going to affect everybody, no matter sort of what pathway they take. Climate change is going to be impacting on people, and we're increasingly seeing things like climate risk needing to be taken into account for businesses, even if the business has nothing to do with the climate space itself, but just what are the risks that climate change poses, and how can that company play a role as well in terms of the climate change mitigation. And then we also have the climate communication all the way through to sort of how do we communicate with policymakers, and you can see that playing out through the COP26 process, and how do we go from the science to then sort of what has to be done if we are to meet the Paris Agreement. So I think, yeah, climate communication is a huge responsibility for people working in this space.
Yeah, certainly. So it's like people talking about climate justice, or and so on. But lately, yeah, that's also related too. So Kumiko, what about in the field where you visited, and do you see any activities, or do you engage those educational activities as well?
Well, in many developing countries that I've ever visited so far, I hear a lot of stories. They are feeling the climate change and not really see the clear activities to mitigate it by education of kids. So far, maybe I'm not seeing around well, but I don't really see any very good activities for that. But I think the first step is to get the people's awareness of the issue, and now it's happening. Then the people will go much deeper to educate younger generations to change their behaviors, and I just hope it.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. So I think, yeah, also like our two universities, like SDGs 17, the final, but not the least, the target, that's the partnership, right? So that is a key to solve or tackle these issues, isn't it? So. Okay, so now the time is running out, but I'd like to ask you the final comments or remarks to make first, Nerilie, if you have any.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's been a great conversation, and I think that when we're talking about climate change, we are facing sort of a race now, and every year matters. And there is a lot of focus on the emission reductions, but there's other things that we also need to be making sure that we keep an eye on as well. So that we absolutely have to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as we can. We also need to be developing the technology to go beyond the net zero. We need to be looking at what are the technologies that we can use to help to pull some of this carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, because we're going to need that as well. But I think one of the issues that we've touched on in a number of sort of points here is also just the inequality of climate change, and that we really need to make sure that that's a focus of our discussions and our solutions as well, because everybody around the world is impacted by climate change, but often the people who are most impacted are the ones who have done the least to actually cause the problem. And so we do need to make sure that we're looking at how we can have an equitable solution to the problem.
Yeah, thank you. Kumiko?
Okay, it was really a great opportunity to have this kind of dialogue on this occasion. I really appreciate it. And I learned a lot of the professional stories from Nerilie about the climate change for the future. And just to wrap up, I would like to mention that the water is really related to human lives and ecosystems and the climate, of course. And we probably need some grassroots change of the activities or behaviors to save the water. And also we also need to think a bit a higher level movement to change the social systems for the better world in the future. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your lively and very timely discussions today. Yeah, and thank you for your time. Hopefully, we can have another one, face to face, after the COVID-19. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.